At 11:57 p.m. on the 12th of March, 1928, a concrete dam in a narrow canyon north of Los Angeles fractured for the first time. It was the St. Francis Dam, a massive curved gravity structure standing 185 feet tall and holding back 12 billion gallons of water in a reservoir that stretched for miles through the San Francisco Canyon. The dam had been built to supply water to the growing city of Los Angeles. At that hour, the canyon was quiet. The dam was unstaffed. There were no alarms, no sirens, only the sound of water escaping through a crack that had opened in the west abutment. At 11:58 p.m., the crack widened. A thin jet of water began to spout from the base of the dam, washing away the rocky foundation. The structure had been in service for just over 2 years. It was considered a triumph of modern engineering, designed and supervised by William Mulholland, the chief engineer of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the same man who had built the Los Angeles Aqueduct. But in the next 60 seconds, everything changed. At 11:59 p.m., the dam's central section began to lean forward. The concrete was not reinforced with steel. It was a gravity dam, relying entirely on its own weight to hold back the water. That weight was now working against it, pushing the entire mass downstream. The foundation beneath the dam had softened. The rock was not the solid granite Mulholland had assumed. It was a mixture of schist and conglomerate, with layers of clay that turned to mud when saturated. The water from the initial crack had seeped into those layers, lubricating the base. At a few seconds past midnight on the 13th of March, 1928, the entire center of the dam gave way. The failure was not a gradual collapse. It was an instantaneous release. A wall of water 200 feet high at the breach surged down the canyon. The concrete blocks of the dam, some weighing 10,000 tons, were swept away like gravel. The noise was described later by survivors as a low rumble that grew into a roar, then a shaking of the ground that felt like an earthquake. At 12:01 a.m., the flood wave hit the first structures downstream. Powerhouse Number 2, a hydroelectric facility operated by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, was located less than a mile below the dam. It was staffed at that hour by a small crew. They had no warning. The building was obliterated. Every person inside died. The turbines, the generators, the transformers, all of it was crushed or swept away. The flood carried the wreckage forward, adding debris to the already destructive water. At 12:05 a.m., the wave reached the Edison Company's substation and switching yard, also in the canyon. The electrical equipment was destroyed. The lights of the San Francisco Canyon suddenly went dark. There was no communication left. The telephone lines were down. The flood had already severed the only road and the only telegraph connection that linked the canyon communities to the outside world. At 12:10 a.m., the wave entered the town of Peru at the mouth of the canyon. But Peru was not the worst hit. The flood continued westward and then southward, following the Santa Clara River Valley. It took roughly an hour for the flood to travel the 54 miles to the Pacific Ocean. Along the way, it passed through or destroyed the communities of Castaic, Val Verde, Newhall, Saugus, Bardstown, Fillmore, Santa Paula, and Saticoy. In each town, the water arrived without any formal warning. Some residents heard the roar and tried to flee. Others were asleep. Many were simply caught. The flood carried not only water but a slurry of mud, rocks, trees, cars, houses, and bodies. When it reached the ocean, it dumped much of that debris into the surf. In the days that followed, bodies were found washed up on beaches as far south as San Diego. The official death toll was later set at 431, but that number was almost certainly an underestimate. Many victims were never recovered. Farm workers, migrant families, and people living in remote shacks along the river had not been counted in the census. Some historians estimate that the actual number may have exceeded 600. What happened? The St. Francis Dam collapse was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made failure. It occurred because the dam was built on a foundation that could not support the weight and the water. It occurred because the design assumptions were wrong. It occurred because warning signs went unheeded. And it occurred because the man in charge, William Mulholland, was an engineer of immense skill and reputation, but also of immense stubbornness and certainty. He had built the dam. He had inspected it himself just hours before the collapse. He had declared it safe. On the morning of March 12, 1928, Mulholland had driven up to the dam with his assistant, Harvey Van Norman. They walked along the crest. Mulholland had been concerned about reports of water seepage from the canyon walls. He saw the leaks, but he judged them to be typical for a dam of this type. He ordered a small amount of cement to be used to seal one of the cracks. Then he left. That evening, at about 10:30 p.m., a caretaker named Tony Harnischfeger, who lived with his family in a house near the dam, noticed a new crack in the west abutment. He called the powerhouse number 2 operator to report it. The operator told him to watch it. Harnischfeger did not call Mulholland. He did not call anyone else. He simply watched as the crack grew. At 11:30 p.m., the crack was still there. At 11:45, it was larger. At 11:55, Harnischfeger and his wife and son fled the house. They climbed the hillside. They survived, but they did not raise an alarm. There was no way to raise an alarm. The telephone lines were down by then, and even if they had been up, no one would have believed that the dam could fail that quickly. Mulholland himself was at his home in Los Angeles when the dam collapsed. He learned of the disaster only when a call came through to his office at the Department of Water and Power sometime after midnight. He drove to the canyon. By the time he arrived, the reservoir was empty. The dam was a jagged ruin. He stood on the rubble and said famously to a reporter, "Don't blame anyone else. You just fasten it on me. If there was an error in human judgment, I was the human." That statement, offered in the immediate aftermath, summed up the complex reality of the disaster. It was an error in human judgment. But the judgment had been shaped by a system that encouraged speed over caution, that rewarded completion over scrutiny, and that trusted one man's experience over the evidence of the ground itself. The St. Francis Dam was part of the broader Los Angeles aqueduct system, which brought water from the Owens Valley to the city. The dam was built to store water from that aqueduct. Construction began in 1924 and finished in 1926. It was designed by Mulholland and his staff. The design was conventional for the time, a straight gravity dam made of concrete, thick at the base and thin at the crest. But the geology of the site was problematic from the start. The canyon walls were composed of weathered schist, a weak, friable rock that easily crumbled. The dam's foundation was placed partly on this schist and partly on a harder conglomerate. The transition between the two rock types created a fault line. When the reservoir filled, water under pressure invaded the fissures in the schist. The rock slowly disintegrated. The foundation lost its strength. The dam began to lift and tilt. The men who built the dam noticed cracks during construction. They sealed them. They did not investigate the cause. In the years after the collapse, investigators from the state of California, the American Society of Civil Engineers, and various independent consultants examined the site. They dug test pits. They drilled core samples. They analyzed the concrete and the foundation rock. Their conclusions were unanimous. The collapse was caused by a failure of the foundation material under the left abutment, which had been weakened by water saturation and hydraulic uplift. The dam itself, as a concrete structure, was not at fault. It was the ground that gave way. But that conclusion did not absolve the engineers. The foundation had not been adequately explored before construction. No borings were taken to determine the depth or quality of the rock. The site was inspected only by surface examination and by digging a few shallow test pits. Mulholland relied on his instinct and his experience. He had built many dams. He believed he could tell good rock from bad by looking at it. In this case, he was mistaken. The failure of oversight was not limited to Mulholland. The dam had been approved by the California state engineer, but his office did not have a rigorous review process. The dam was a municipal project, not a private one, and it fell under less stringent regulations. There were no independent checks. The men who designed it also built it. The men who built it also inspected it. There was no one to say no. The disaster itself unfolded with a speed that stunned even Mulholland. The total failure of the dam took less than a few minutes. From the first visible crack to the complete collapse, less than an hour passed. The flood wave moved at an average speed of 15 miles per hour through the valley. It was not the fastest flood in history, but it was one of the most destructive because it came without warning. The communities downstream had no emergency plans. There was no siren, no telephone tree, no way to evacuate. Some people were saved by neighbors who saw the water coming and knocked on doors. Others were saved by chance, by being awake, by being away from home. But many were not. In the aftermath, the rescue effort was massive. Hundreds of men from nearby towns, from the Army Corps of Engineers, from the Red Cross, from the Los Angeles Police Department, combed the debris for survivors and bodies. Hospitals in Santa Paula and Ventura were overwhelmed. The recovery of remains continued for months. The coroner's inquest convened in Los Angeles. Mulholland testified. He answered questions calmly. He admitted that he had not made borings. He said he did not think they were necessary. He said the dam had been built on sound rock. He was wrong, and he said so. The inquest did not recommend criminal charges. The disaster was ruled an accident. But the professional consequences were severe. Mulholland resigned from the Department of Water and Power. He lived the rest of his life in obscurity and died in 1935. His reputation, once that of a hero who brought water to a desert city, was permanently damaged. The St. Francis Dam was never rebuilt. The site remains a ruin, a ghostly reminder of what happens when confidence outruns caution. Why does the St. Francis Dam collapse still matter? It matters because it was a turning point in dam safety in the United States. Before 1928, dam design and construction were largely unregulated. After the disaster, California created a state commission to oversee dam safety. Other states followed. The engineering profession established standards for foundation investigation, for spillway capacity, for instrumentation and monitoring. The lesson of the St. Francis Dam became a textbook case in geology and engineering. It was taught in universities. It was cited in courtrooms. It was referenced whenever a new dam was proposed. But the lesson is not only about dams. It is about the human tendency to trust in systems that have not been tested. Mulholland believed in his dam. He believed in his own judgment. He believed that the leaks and cracks were normal. He was not a villain. He was a brilliant engineer who made a catastrophic error. The error was not malice. It was overconfidence. And overconfidence, when combined with power and responsibility, can kill people. The collapse of the St. Francis Dam is one of the worst civil engineering disasters in American history. It ranks alongside the Johnstown flood of 1889, the Texas City disaster of 1947, and the collapse of the I-35W bridge in Minneapolis in 2007. Each disaster teaches a similar lesson, that human structures are only as strong as the ground they are built on, and that the ground is always more complex than any map or model can show. In the canyon today, very little remains. The concrete is gone. The reservoir is gone. The canyon has returned to a wild state, but there is a plaque at the site. It lists the names of the known victims. It was placed there by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. It is a simple monument, unadorned. And on certain nights, when the wind blows through the canyon, visitors say they can hear the echo of the flood. But that is likely just the water flowing in the creek below. The real echo is in the laws and the standards and the engineering practices that changed because of that single moment before midnight. The St. Francis Dam collapse was not an act of God. It was not a random event. It was a failure of knowledge, of inspection, of communication, and of humility. It was a disaster that could have been prevented, and its prevention cost nothing more than a willingness to ask hard questions about the ground beneath our feet. Those questions were not asked, and then the water came. This is the story of the St. Francis Dam. It is a story about a wall of concrete, a canyon, a man, and a city. It is about the weight of 12 billion gallons of water pressing against a structure that was not quite strong enough. and it is about what happens in the final minutes before midnight, when the cracks grow wide and the foundation turns to mud. To understand those final minutes, we must return to the evening of March 12, 1928, and trace the events hour by hour. The setting is the St. Francis Dam, a concrete gravity structure standing 600 feet wide at its base and 185 feet high, holding back a reservoir that stretched 3 miles up San Francisco Canyon. The reservoir was nearly full. The water level stood just inches below the spillway crest. The dam had been in service for 2 years, but it was leaking. That fact was known. At 11:30 p.m. on March 12th, a night watchman named Tony Harnischfeger was making his rounds along the crest of the dam. He carried a lantern and a notebook. He had worked at the dam for several months and had seen the leaks before. They were small and steady, and Mulholland had assured him they were normal. But tonight, something was different. As Harnischfeger walked the length of the dam, he noticed a new crack running horizontally across the downstream face, about 20 feet above the base. It was not large, maybe the width of a finger, but it ran from the left abutment toward the center. He made a note. He did not raise an alarm. What happened next is pieced together from the accounts of survivors, the testimony of workers, and the physical evidence recovered after the collapse. At 11:45 p.m., a truck driver named Charlie Van Norman was parked near the dam, waiting for a load of gravel to be dumped from the construction area above. He saw a streak of water shoot from the left abutment, a jet that hit the canyon wall across from the dam. The water was dirty and brown, carrying sediment. Van Norman later said he thought the dam was about to go. He turned his truck around and drove down the canyon, honking his horn, trying to warn the few families living below. He did not have time to reach many. At 11:50 p.m., Harnischfeger walked back to the caretaker's house at the base of the dam. He told his wife, Leona, about the crack. She urged him to call the Department of Water and Power in Los Angeles. He did. The switchboard operator connected him to the night engineer, but the conversation was brief. Harnischfeger described the crack. The engineer said he would send someone in the morning. The call was logged at 11:55 p.m. That was the last official communication from the dam. At 11:57 p.m., a farmer named Edgar Heinz was sitting on his porch, 3 miles down the canyon. He heard a low rumble like distant thunder, but the sky was clear. He looked up the canyon and saw the lamps of the dam flicker and go dark. Then the rumble grew louder, and he felt the ground shake. Heinz ran into his house and shouted for his family to get out. They climbed onto the roof of their barn as a wall of water, black and filled with debris, crashed through the canyon. The house was swept away. They held onto the roof as it lifted and spun. Heinz later said the water carried them 2 miles before they were thrown onto the bank. At midnight, the dam was gone. The entire center section had washed out. A quarter of a mile of concrete, weighing 120,000 tons, had been ripped from its foundation. The remaining stubs on either side of the canyon stood like broken teeth. The reservoir emptied completely in 70 minutes. The flood wave that emerged was a massive surge, at least 140 feet high in the narrows of the canyon, slowing to 40 feet when it hit the wider valley. It carried boulders, trees, cars, houses, and people. The flood traveled at an average speed of 15 to 18 miles per hour, faster than a person could run. It followed the course of San Francisco Creek, then the Santa Clara River, reaching the Pacific Ocean near Ventura 5.5 hours later. The primary path of destruction was a narrow corridor, about a mile wide, stretching 54 miles from the dam to the sea. In the town of Castaic Junction, 7 miles downstream, the flood arrived at 12:15 a.m. The community was small: a gas station, a store, a dozen houses. Most residents were asleep. The water struck without warning. The store was torn from its foundation. The gas station was flattened. 12 people died in Castaic Junction. At 12:30 a.m., the flood reached the community of Peru. The water was lower here, about 20 feet deep, but still destructive. The town had a school, a church, and a cluster of homes. Families had gathered for a dance that evening at the schoolhouse. Many had just returned home. The flood caught them as they were undressing for bed. 29 people died in Peru. At 1 a.m., the flood swept through the town of Fillmore. The water was now about 15 feet high, but it carried debris that turned it into a battering ram. The main street was destroyed. The railroad depot was lifted from its tracks. 32 people died in Fillmore. At 1:30 a.m., the flood entered Santa Paula, the largest town in the path. The population was about 7,000. The water was 10 feet deep, but the debris had become a thick mass of mud, timber, and mangled metal. The business district was crushed. The railroad bridge collapsed. The hospital was flooded, but patients were evacuated to the second floor. 59 people died in Santa Paula. At 2 a.m., the flood approached the city of Ventura, near the coast. By this point, the wave had spread out and slowed to a depth of about 5 feet. It still damaged low-lying areas, but the population had been partially warned by telephone calls from upstream. Only a few died in Ventura. By dawn, the flood had reached the ocean. The river turned a muddy brown for miles offshore. Fishermen reported seeing bodies floating in the surf. The death toll is not precise. Official records list 431 confirmed victims, but many bodies were never found. The flood carried people out to sea. Some were buried in the mud and debris and were not recovered for years. The final count may have exceeded 500. Entire families were erased. The crash of the dam killed more people than any other single dam failure in American history, excluding the Johnstown flood of 1889, which was caused by a different mechanism. In the immediate aftermath, the rescue effort was chaotic but determined. The Red Cross set up relief stations in Santa Paula and Ventura. The National Guard arrived to secure the area and prevent looting. Physicians and nurses from Los Angeles drove through the night to set up field hospitals. The morgue in Santa Paula was quickly overwhelmed. Bodies were laid out in a school gymnasium. Many were unidentified. Volunteers collected personal effects: rings, watches, wallets, photographs. Some families never found their missing. The search for survivors lasted 2 weeks. Men with grappling hooks dragged the river channels. Boats patrolled the floodplain. Every pile of debris was turned over. In some cases, people were found alive, pinned under trees or trapped in the mud days after the flood. One man was found clinging to the roof of a collapsed house, 15 miles from his original home. He had been carried that distance and survived. The legal investigation began on March 21, 1928, when a coroner's inquest convened in Los Angeles. The jury included engineers, attorneys, and public officials. The hearings lasted 8 days. Witnesses included dam workers, supervisors, engineers, and William Mulholland himself. Mulholland testified on March 22. He was seated, composed, but there was a weariness in his voice. He explained the design, the construction, the leaks. He admitted that he had not ordered borings to test the foundation rock. He said he relied on visual inspection and his experience. When asked if he considered the dam safe, he replied, "I did. I believed it was as safe as any dam I ever built." When asked about the cracks that appeared during construction, he said he considered them normal and expected. He said he had no reason to believe the foundation was failing. The inquest jury returned a verdict on March 30th. They found that the dam collapsed due to a foundation failure and that no criminal negligence had been proven. They recommended that the state legislature create a board of dam safety to oversee all future dam construction. They also recommended that all existing dams be inspected. The professional investigation was carried out by a board of engineers appointed by the governor of California. The board included 2 professors from the University of California, a consulting engineer from the Bureau of Reclamation, and an expert in soil mechanics. They spent 3 months at the site. They excavated the foundation of the dam, drilled core samples, analyzed the rock, and reconstructed the failure sequence. Their report, published in October 1928, was a landmark in civil engineering. The board's key finding was that the left abutment of the dam rested on a stratum of mica schist, a rock that became slippery when wet. The schist was not solid. It was fractured and jointed. Water from the reservoir had seeped into these fractures, lubricating the rock and reducing its strength. The weight of the concrete dam, combined with the upward pressure of water beneath the foundation, caused the schist to slide along a bedding plane. The dam lifted and tilted. The concrete cracked. The reservoir water poured through the cracks, eroding the foundation further. Within minutes, the entire structure was undermined and failed. The board also criticized the design for lacking a proper cutoff wall and for not providing adequate drainage beneath the dam. They noted that the foundation had never been thoroughly investigated. They concluded that the disaster was avoidable. The St. Francis Dam collapse changed the practice of dam engineering in the United States. In 1929, California passed the Dam Safety Act, which created the State Division of Dam Safety and required all dams over a certain height to be approved by the state engineer. The act mandated foundation investigations, spillway capacity calculations, and periodic inspections. Other states followed with similar laws. In 1930, the American Society of Civil Engineers published a set of guidelines for the design of gravity dams, which became a standard reference. The guidelines emphasized the importance of foundation geology, uplift pressure measurement, and the installation of drainage galleries inside dams. The St. Francis Dam was cited as the classic example of a foundation failure. The disaster also had a lasting impact on the public perception of large infrastructure projects. Before 1928, dams were seen as symbols of progress and human mastery over nature. After St. Francis, the public became aware that engineering failures could be catastrophic. The term dam safety entered the common vocabulary. William Mulholland never recovered. After the inquest, he resigned from the Department of Water and Power. He retreated to his home in Los Angeles. He gave no more interviews. He had been a hero, the man who built the Owens Valley Aqueduct and brought life to a desert city. Now he was a figure of tragedy. He died on July 12, 1935, at the age of 75. His obituary in the Los Angeles Times noted his contributions, but also mentioned the dam collapse. The two were linked forever. The families of the victims sought compensation. The city of Los Angeles and the Department of Water and Power were sued. In 1931, a settlement was reached. The city paid a total of $1,750,000 to the victims' families, an average of about $4,000 per claim. Some families accepted the settlement. Others rejected it and pursued individual lawsuits, but most were unsuccessful. The legal precedent established that a municipality could be held liable for the negligence of its employees, but the burden of proof was high. The St. Francis Dam collapse remains a cautionary tale in engineering education. It is taught in geology and civil engineering courses as a case study in site investigation. It is used to illustrate the danger of assuming that the ground is stable without rigorous testing. It is a reminder that nature is not always forgiving, but the story is also about human courage and resilience. In the towns along the Santa Clara River, the survivors rebuilt. The dead were buried in mass graves and in individual plots. Memorial services were held every year for a decade. Today, a small monument stands at the dam site, listing the names of the known victims. It is maintained by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the same agency that built the dam. Visitors to the site can see the remaining concrete stubs on either side of the canyon. The canyon itself is quiet. The creek runs clear. The scars of the flood have healed, but the ground beneath is still the same schist that failed in one night wide. The lesson is not only about dams. It is about the boundaries of human knowledge and the cost of ignoring them. In the final minutes before midnight, the St. Francis Dam gave way. The water came. It swept away everything in its path, and in the silence that followed, the questions began. Why was the foundation not tested? Why were the leaks ignored? Why was there no warning system? Why did no one listen to the watchman who saw the crack? The answers are not simple. They involve overconfidence, bureaucracy, and a failure of communication. They involve a system that trusted one man's judgment over the evidence of the ground itself. They involve the human tendency to believe that because something has not failed yet, it will not fail tomorrow. The St. Francis Dam collapsed on March 12, 1928, at midnight. That date is now known as the night the water broke free. It is a night that changed California, changed engineering, and changed the way we think about the structures we build. And yet the dam itself remains a ghost. The concrete is gone. The reservoir is gone. The floodplain has been rebuilt. The families have moved on. But the memory of that night, of the crack that ran across the dam, of the watchman's unanswered call, of the wall of water that killed 431 people, is still present. It is present in every dam that is inspected, every foundation that is drilled, every regulation that is enforced. It is present in the quiet caution of every engineer who looks at a canyon and wonders. This is the story of the St. Francis Dam. It is a story of what happens when we ask too little of the ground and trust too much in our own creations. It is a story that begins with a crack in the darkness and ends with a flood that no one could stop. And in between, there were minutes that could have been seconds, and seconds that could have been hours, and a single decision that could have saved them all. But that decision was never made. The water came, and the dam fell, and the dam fell. Within seconds, the entire center section of the dam disintegrated. The concrete that had stood for 2 years crumbled into blocks weighing hundreds of tons. The water, held back by a wall that had been 35 feet thick at its base, now had nothing to stop it. A wall of water, initially estimated at 120 feet high, surged down San Francisco Canyon. The flood carried with it debris, broken concrete, trees, boulders, and the remains of the construction camp below the dam. At 12:01 a.m. on March 13, 1928, the water reached the construction camp. 59 men, women, and children were living there. Most were asleep. The flood hit without warning. The camp was obliterated. Only a few survivors managed to scramble to higher ground. The watchman who had seen the crack and sounded the alarm was among the dead. By 12:05 a.m., the flood wave had funneled into the narrow canyon and gained speed. It traveled at an estimated 20 miles per hour. The water was dark, filled with mud and debris. It was not a wave like an ocean wave. It was a moving mountain of water that scoured the canyon walls. The first group of houses outside the canyon was in the community of Peru, about 15 miles downstream. The water arrived at approximately 12:30 a.m. Some residents heard a rumbling sound and fled. Others were swept away as they slept. The flood destroyed the Peru schoolhouse, the general store, and several homes. The number of dead in Peru was later counted at 56. From Peru, the flood continued south along the Santa Clara River. The river valley was wide and flat, so the flood spread out. The depth decreased, but the volume was still immense. The water carried vehicles, livestock, telephone poles, and entire buildings. Survivors described a sound like a freight train. By 1 a.m., the flood reached the town of Fillmore. The population was about 2,000. The water rose quickly, filling the streets and entering homes. The Fillmore police chief, notified by telephone from Peru, had only a few minutes to warn people. Some fled to the hills. Others climbed onto rooftops. The high school was used as a refuge. The flood took 43 lives in Fillmore. The flood continued to Bardstown, a farming community. There, the water washed away dozens of houses and killed at least 30 people. By 2 a.m., the wave reached Santa Paula. The Santa Clara River ran through the center of town. The flood overtopped the riverbanks and inundated the business district. Residents fled to the upper floors of buildings. The post office, the courthouse, and the fire station were flooded. 23 people died in Santa Paula. By 3 a.m., the flood reached Saticoy. The water was now about 10 feet deep, but still moving with force. The flood destroyed the Saticoy Bridge, a steel structure that had been built in 1908. The bridge collapsed under the weight of debris. Witnesses saw cars and trucks plunge into the water. At least 18 people died in Saticoy. The final major city in the path was Ventura on the coast. The flood arrived around 4 a.m. By then. The wave had spread so wide that the water depth was only a few feet, but the flow was still dangerous. The Ventura River, which normally carried only a trickle, became a torrent. The water reached the beach and pushed out into the Pacific Ocean. The ocean turned brown with mud for miles. Bodies were later found floating off the coast. The flood traveled 54 miles from the dam site to the ocean. It took about 4 hours to complete that journey. In that time, it killed an estimated 431 people. The exact number was never determined because many bodies were never recovered. The official list of known dead includes 386 named individuals, but the coroner's office counted 431. Some estimates go higher, suggesting that migrant workers and transient laborers who lived in the floodplain may have been uncounted. The search for survivors and bodies began at dawn on March 13th. Volunteers came from all over Southern California. The Red Cross set up emergency stations in Fillmore, Santa Paula, and Ventura. Doctors set up field hospitals. The National Guard was deployed to maintain order and to assist in the recovery. The task was gruesome. Bodies were found tangled in barbed wire, buried under mud, or wedged in trees. Some were carried as far as 5 miles out to sea. The coroner's office established a temporary morgue in a school in Santa Paula. The bodies were laid out on the floor and identified by relatives. Many were too disfigured to recognize. Family members searched through clothes, jewelry, and personal effects. The disaster also took the lives of entire families. In some cases, no one survived to identify the dead. A mass grave was dug in the Santa Paula Cemetery. 163 unidentified victims were buried there in a single ceremony on March 17th. The service was attended by thousands. A single headstone reads, "Unknown victims of the St. Francis Dam disaster." The legal aftermath was complex. Lawsuits were filed against the city of Los Angeles. The plaintiffs argued that the dam had been negligently designed and constructed. The defense argued that the collapse was an act of God. The trial lasted several years. In 1931, a settlement was reached. The city paid $1,750,000 in total. Most families received between $1,000 and $10,000, but the settlement was not an admission of guilt. The city never accepted responsibility. The engineering investigation, led by the board appointed by the governor, produced a report that was both technical and devastating. The board found that the foundation rock, a mica schist, contained a clay-like material that lost strength when wet. The dam had been built on a slope of this schist, which dipped downstream. The weight of the dam and the water pressure caused the rock to slide along a bedding plane. The dam literally slid off its foundation. The board also noted that Mulholland had ignored warnings. In 1925, a geologist named F.L. Ransom had examined the site and reported that the rock was faulty and unsuitable. Mulholland dismissed the report. He believed that concrete could compensate for poor rock. He was wrong. The report raised a deeper question. Why did no one catch the problem? The answer lies in the culture of the time. In the 180s, dam engineering was still an emerging science. There were no standard procedures for foundation investigation. There were no state regulations. The Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers had their own guidelines, but those did not apply to municipal projects. Mulholland was considered a genius. His word was trusted. The system lacked checks and balances. After the disaster, California became the first state to establish a dam safety program. The Division of Dam Safety was created in 1919. It required that all dams above a certain height be approved by the state engineer. The approval process included a review of foundation geology, spillway capacity, and design calculations. The division also conducted periodic inspections. In the following decades, other states adopted similar laws. The St. Francis Dam collapse also influenced the curriculum at engineering schools. The failure became a classic case study in geotechnical engineering. It is still taught today as an example of how ignoring geology can lead to catastrophe. Every civil engineering student learns the lesson. The ground is not a given, it must be tested. But the human cost is what lingers. The stories of the survivors are preserved in archives and oral histories. One woman, who was 7 years old at the time, remembered being carried by the water and grabbing onto a tree. She held on for hours until rescuers found her. She lost her mother, father, and 3 siblings. Another man, a farmer in Fillmore, woke to the sound of a bell. He ran to the hills with his wife and children. He survived. His neighbor did not. The watchman who had seen the crack and tried to warn others was named Frank. His full name was Frank L. Wing. He had been employed by the water department for years. He lived in a small house near the dam. When he saw the crack, he telephoned the power plant downstream. The operator there, a man named R.L. O'Rourke, heard Wing's voice crack with fear. Wing said, "The dam is going out." Then the line went dead. Wing's body was never found. The power plant operator, O'Rourke, managed to warn some people downstream before the flood destroyed the plant. He survived by climbing a ladder to the roof. He later testified at the inquest. He said that Wing had called him several times in the days before the collapse, reporting leaks and cracks. O'Rourke had passed those reports up the chain. Nothing was done. The inquest also heard from a man named John B. Williams, a carpenter who had worked on the dam. Williams testified that he had seen cracks in the concrete during construction. He told his foreman, but the work continued. He said that the concrete was poured in haste, without proper curing. The foreman denied this. The inquest believed Williams. The failure of communication was not just within the water department. It extended to the public. No one living downstream had been warned before the collapse. There was no emergency plan. The floodplain was densely populated, but there were no sirens, no evacuation routes. The only warnings came from neighbors who heard the roar and passed the word. After the disaster, the city of Los Angeles installed a warning system for all its dams. The system included sirens, telephones, and patrols, but it was too late for the victims. The question that remains is whether the disaster could have been prevented if there had been a culture of safety. The answer is yes. The St. Francis Dam collapse is often compared to the Johnstown flood of 1889, which killed over 2,000 people. Both disasters involved the failure of a poorly designed dam. Both led to changes in law and practice. But the St. Francis Dam is unique because of the role of William Mulholland. He was not a villain in the traditional sense. He was a man who had built the greatest water system in the American West. He had brought water to Los Angeles, enabling the city to grow from a small town to a metropolis. He was a hero, but his confidence became arrogance. In the years after the collapse, Mulholland lived quietly. He rarely left his home. He gave no interviews. He was visited by friends and former colleagues, but he did not speak of the dam. His wife died in 1930. He lived alone. When he died in 1935, his funeral was private. The city of Los Angeles did not honor him in the way it had once planned. The St. Francis Dam had erased his legacy. The disaster also had an environmental impact. The flood scoured the riverbed, removing topsoil and vegetation. The recovery of the ecosystem took decades. In some areas, the river channel was permanently widened. The flood deposited debris in the ocean, creating a temporary sandbar. The coastal currents carried the sediment north and south. Today, the site of the dam is a state historic landmark. A plaque marks the location. The concrete stubs remain, overgrown with brush. The reservoir basin is now a dry canyon with a small stream. The Santa Clara River is still flood-prone, but dams upstream now control the flow. The lessons of 1928 are built into the infrastructure, but there is one more question. What about the people who died? They were mostly working-class families. They were farmers, laborers, ranchers, and their children. They were not famous. They did not leave behind diaries or memoirs. Their names are carved on a stone monument at the dam site. The monument was dedicated in 1920. It lists 431 names, arranged alphabetically. There are many surnames repeated, indicating multiple members of the same family. The monument is visited by hikers and history buffs. It is maintained by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. The same agency that built the dam now cares for its memorial. The irony is not lost on those who know the story. In the end, The St. Francis Dam collapse is a story about the limits of human knowledge. It is about what happens when we trust too much in our ability to control nature. It is about the quiet moments before disaster, when a crack appears but no one speaks. It is about the seconds that could have been minutes and the minutes that could have been hours. It is about a decision that was never made because no one thought it necessary. The dam fell at midnight, the water came, and 431 people died. That is the number. But behind that number are thousands of lives, the families who lost their homes, the children who grew up without parents, the communities that rebuilt from rubble. The flood washed away more than concrete. It washed away innocence. And now, almost a century later, the dam is gone, but the lesson remains. Every dam built since 1928 has been tested, inspected, and questioned. Every engineer knows the name St. Francis. Every foundation investigation begins with a core sample and a question. What if the ground is not as strong as we think? The story does not end with the flood. It continues in every safety regulation, every inspection report, every engineering textbook. It continues in the memory of that night when the crack appeared and no one stopped it. It continues in the question that still haunts the profession. What are we missing today? The St. Francis Dam collapsed on March 12, 1928 at 11:58 p.m. That is the official time. But the real clock started ticking long before. It started when the mica schist began to slip. It started when the leaks were ignored. It started when one man's judgment overruled the evidence of the rock. And at 2 minutes before midnight, the dam gave way. The silence after the flood was deep. The survivors stood in the mud and looked at what had been their homes. The water had receded, leaving behind wreckage and bodies. The sky was clear. The stars were out. It was the same sky that had been there before the dam, before the city, before the aqueduct. Nature had reclaimed the valley, but the people rebuilt. They always do. They buried their dead. They repaired the roads. They planted new crops. They built new bridges. The flood became a story told by grandparents to grandchildren. And in time, the story became a warning. The St. Francis Dam remains one of the deadliest civil engineering failures in American history. It is a reminder that progress comes with risk. It is a reminder that the ground beneath our feet is not solid. It is a reminder that the structures we build are only as strong as the foundations we give them. And it is a reminder that sometimes the worst disasters are not the ones we cannot predict. They are the ones we saw coming but chose to ignore. That is the story of the St. Francis Dam, and it is a story that will never fully end. At 3 a.m. on the 13th of March 1928, the first rescuers entered the Santa Clara River Valley. They were not professionals. They were ranchers, oil field workers, and volunteers from the towns of Fillmore and Santa Paula. They carried shovels, ropes, and lanterns. The flood had passed, but the mud was deep. The debris was tangled. The bodies were scattered. By daylight, the scale of the destruction became visible. The entire valley floor was covered in silt and wreckage. Houses had been lifted from their foundations and deposited miles downstream. Trees were stripped of bark. Railroad tracks were twisted like wire. The highway bridge at Peru had vanished. The road itself was gone in many places. The survivors were found huddled on high ground. Some had climbed trees. Others had been carried by the water and deposited on sandbars. A woman named Maria Garcia was found clinging to a fence post near the Ventura County line. She had been swept 3 miles from her home. Her husband and 2 children were missing. They were never found. The first official response came from the Los Angeles Police Department. They dispatched officers to the scene, but the roads were impassable. The officers had to walk the last 5 miles. The National Guard was called in. Governor C.C. Young declared martial law in the affected areas. The Red Cross set up relief stations in Fillmore and Santa Paula. The search for bodies continued for weeks. Crews used grappling hooks to drag the river. They searched the debris piles. They dug through the mud. Many bodies were found far downstream, some near the ocean. The last identified victim was recovered in May 1929, more than a year after the flood. The inquest began on March 21, 1928, in the Ventura County Courthouse. The coroner's jury heard testimony from engineers, workmen, and survivors. The first witness was William Mulholland. He appeared calm. He wore a dark suit. He answered every question directly. He admitted that he had not inspected the dam after the leaks were reported. He said he trusted his judgment. The jury asked about the geology. Mulholland explained that the dam was built on mica schist, a rock he considered stable. He said the foundation had been tested, but under cross-examination, he admitted that the tests were limited. He had not ordered core samples of the foundation. He had relied on visual inspection. The next witness was Harvey Van Norman, Mulholland's assistant. Van Norman testified that he had inspected the dam on the morning of March 12th. He had seen the crack. He had spoken to the caretaker, Tony Harnischfeger. He had decided that the crack was not serious. He left without reporting it to Mulholland. He admitted that he had made a mistake. The jury also heard from the caretaker's wife, Leona. She testified that she had seen water seeping through the wing of the dam for weeks. She had told her husband. He had told the supervisors. Nothing was done. She said that on the night of the collapse she heard a rumbling sound. She ran outside. She saw the dam begin to crumble. She ran. She survived. Her husband did not. The testimony of the geologists was damning. A professor from the California Institute of Technology, John B. Beck, testified that the mica schist on the east side of the dam was heavily fractured. He said that water had seeped into the cracks, lubricating the rock. The weight of the reservoir had caused the ground to slip. The dam was not designed to withstand that movement. Another geologist, Richard H. Johns, later conducted a detailed study of the site. He concluded that the landslide was the primary cause of the failure. The dam itself was structurally sound, but the foundation was not. The concrete had not been bonded to the rock. The wing on the east side was built on a prehistoric landslide deposit. When the water filled the reservoir, the deposit became saturated and began to move. The inquest lasted 2 weeks. The jury returned a verdict on April 6, 1928. They found that the collapse was due to a landslide in the foundation. They stated that the dam had been built without adequate investigation of the site. They did not blame Mulholland directly, but they recommended that all dams in California be subjected to a state inspection system. The verdict was not a criminal indictment. No one was prosecuted for the disaster. Mulholland was forced to resign from the water department, but he was not charged. The city of Los Angeles faced civil lawsuits. More than 50 suits were filed. The city settled many of them out of court. Total payouts exceeded $10 million. That is the equivalent of more than $150 million today. But the money did not bring back the dead. The lawsuits dragged on for years. Some families received as little as $1,000. Others received nothing. The legal system was not equipped to handle a disaster of this scale. There was no public fund for the victims. They relied on private charity and the Red Cross. The disaster also changed the culture of dam building. In 1929, the California legislature passed the Dam Safety Act. The law required that all dams be designed by a licensed engineer. It mandated regular inspections and reporting. It created a state agency to oversee dam safety. Other states followed. The federal government later enacted the National Dam Safety Program in 1970, but the most lasting change was in the profession of civil engineering. The St. Francis Dam became a cautionary tale. Engineering schools began teaching the case. Students learned about the geology, the hydrology, the decisions that led to failure. The disaster was included in textbooks as a case study of what happens when engineering judgment overrules evidence. The story also had a personal impact on William Mulholland. He lived until 1935, but he was a broken man. He rarely left his home. He was visited by friends, but he could not speak of the dam. One visitor, a young engineer named John L. Savage, recalled that Mulholland would sit in his chair and stare at the wall. When asked about the dam, he would say only, "I built it. I caused it." Mulholland's death on July 22, 1935, was quiet. The newspapers noted his passing but did not glorify him. The city did not name a building or a statue after him. His legacy was the aqueduct system, but also the dam. He had brought water to Los Angeles, but he had also drowned 130 square miles of the Santa Clara Valley. In the decades that followed, the details of the disaster were studied and restudied. Every generation of engineers revisits the case. In 1945, a new analysis suggested that the concrete itself had weakened over time. The dam had been built with a technique that allowed water to seep into the concrete, causing it to deteriorate. The condition was known as alkali aggregate reaction. It was not understood in 1998. In 1961, a team from the Bureau of Reclamation conducted a simulation. They modeled the failure using modern computational methods. They confirmed that the landslide was the trigger, but they also found that the dam would have collapsed within a few years even without the landslide. The concrete was simply not durable enough. In 1998, a study by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power revisited the site. They took core samples of the remaining concrete and tested the strength. They found that the concrete had lost about 40% of its original strength. The dam had been failing from the inside, but the ultimate cause remains the human element. Mulholland was a man of great ability, but he was also a man who did not like to be questioned. He had built the aqueduct against enormous odds. He had overcome political opposition, financial difficulties, and engineering challenges. He believed that he could do no wrong. That belief killed 431 people. The survivors of the flood did not have the luxury of analysis. They lived in the aftermath. Some rebuilt their homes and stayed in the valley. Others moved away, unable to bear the memories. The town of Santa Paula held a memorial ceremony every year. The names of the victims were read aloud. The ceremony continued until the 198 when the last survivor died. In 1929, a monument was erected at the dam site. It was a simple stone pillar with an inscription, "In memory of those who lost their lives in the St. Francis Dam disaster, March 12, 1928. The names were carved on bronze plates. The monument was dedicated by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. Thousands attended the ceremony, but the monument was not enough for some families. They felt that the dam should never have been built. They felt that the city of Los Angeles had taken their land and their loved ones. The pain did not fade. In 1955, a group of survivors formed the St. Francis Dam Memorial Association. They raised money for a more prominent marker. The new monument was placed at the intersection of State Route 126 and the dam access road. It stands there today. The site of the dam itself has become a place of pilgrimage. Hikers walk the trail to the concrete stubs. They stand at the base of what was once the tallest dam in the world. They look down into the empty canyon. The reservoir is gone. The water is gone. Only the silence remains. But the water did not just disappear. It found new paths. The groundwater in the valley was recharged. The river resumed its natural flow. The ecosystem gradually recovered. By the 1960s, the banks were lined with willows and cottonwoods. The birds returned. The fish returned. The valley healed. The human community healed less quickly. The population of the affected area dropped after the disaster. Many farms were abandoned. The land was sold to developers. In the 1950s, new subdivisions were built on the floodplain. People forgot the danger. Then in 1969, a major flood occurred, reminding everyone of the power of the river. The new dams upstream held, but the flood still caused damage. The warning had been reissued. Today, the St. Francis Dam is a footnote in history for most people, but for engineers it is a touchstone. The disaster is taught in every civil engineering program. It is the subject of books, documentaries, and academic papers. The questions it raises are still relevant. How could a man like Mulholland, a brilliant engineer, make such a fundamental error? The answer lies in the psychology of expertise. Experts develop a confidence in their own judgment that can blind them to evidence. They ignore warnings because they have succeeded in the past. They believe that they are immune to failure. The St. Francis Dam is the story of that hubris. It is also the story of institutional failure. The water department had no independent oversight. Mulholland was the sole authority. He approved his own designs. He conducted his own inspections. There was no one to say no. The system was designed for efficiency, not safety. After the disaster, the profession created checks and balances. Independent peer review became standard. External engineers review the designs. External geologists test the foundations. External inspectors monitor construction. The dam is no longer the work of one man, but the underlying problem remains. Dams are inherently risky. They store enormous amounts of energy. When they fail catastrophically. The only way to prevent failure is to maintain constant vigilance. That means inspecting, testing, and questioning every assumption. The St. Francis Dam collapse was not an act of God. It was an act of human error. The error was not in the design alone. It was in the decision to ignore the evidence. The cracks, the leaks, the seepage, all were warnings. They were not heeded. On March 12, 1928, at 11:58 p.m., the dam gave way. The water rushed down the canyon. It moved at an estimated 30 miles per hour. It carried boulders weighing several tons. It destroyed everything in its path. The sound was heard 10 miles away. The shockwave was recorded on seismographs. The flood traveled 54 miles to the ocean. It took less than 2 hours. The river had never flowed that fast. The water was deep. At some points, the flood rose to a height of 100 feet. It scoured the valley to bedrock. When the water reached the ocean, it created a plume of sediment that extended for miles. The turbidity lasted for days. The coastal currents carried the silt northward. The beaches near Ventura were stained gray for weeks. The aftermath was one of the largest search and rescue operations in California history. 1,000 men were involved. They worked in shifts. They found bodies in trees, in fields, in the wreckage of homes. They found bodies that had been partially buried in mud. They found bodies that had been washed out to sea. The official death toll was 431, but the actual number is unknown. There were transients, undocumented workers, and unregistered residents in the valley. The cemetery records from the time show many burials marked only as unknown. The number could be as high as 500. The youngest victim was an infant, 2 months old. The oldest was a grandmother, 84 years old. The largest single family to die was the Hernandez family of Santa Paula. 10 members perished. Their house was swept away. Only one son survived because he was away visiting relatives. The inquest heard testimony from that son. He described hearing the roar, running to the roof, and being carried downstream. He held onto a piece of wood. He was rescued the next morning. He lived to be 78 years old. He never spoke of the flood again. The survivors built new lives. Some remarried. Some moved to other states. Some became advocates for dam safety. One survivor, a man named James O. Thomas, founded a group called the Flood Victims Association. He lobbied the state legislature for stricter laws. He testified at every hearing. He died in 1962. The disaster also changed the way the media covered catastrophes. The Los Angeles Times devoted front-page coverage for weeks. Photographs of the destruction were published. The public became aware of the dangers of infrastructure failure. The term dam safety entered the public lexicon. In the 193s, the Bureau of Reclamation began a massive dam construction program. Every dam was built with multiple safety features. The designs included spillways, drainage systems, and instrumentation. The engineers had learned from St. Francis, but learning does not guarantee safety. In 1976, the Teton Dam in Idaho collapsed, killing 11 people. The cause was a foundation problem, similar to St. Francis. In 2017, the Oroville Dam spillway in California failed, leading to evacuations. The underlying issue was inadequate design and maintenance. The lessons of 1928 are still not fully applied. The St. Francis Dam is not just a historical event. It is an ongoing warning. Every dam operator knows the name. Every engineer knows the case. Every inspection manual refers to it. The disaster is coded into the DNA of the profession. But the biggest lesson may be about humility. The earth is not static. The ground can shift. The water can seep. The concrete can weaken. The most confident engineer can be wrong. The most careful design can fail. The only defense is constant vigilance and the willingness to listen. In the end, the St. Francis Dam collapse is a story that will never fully end because it is still happening. Every time a dam is built, the same questions must be asked. What is the foundation? What are the cracks? What are the leaks? And what if we are wrong? At 10:15 a.m. on March 13, 1928, less than 12 hours after the dam collapsed, William Mulholland walked into the superintendent's office at the Los Angeles Water Department. His face was pale. His hands shook. He had not slept. He had driven from his home in Los Angeles directly to the dam site, then to the canyon, then back to the office. He had seen the destruction. He had seen the bodies. He told his assistant, "I don't know how I can live with this." He sat down at his desk and began writing a report. That report would become the basis for the official investigation. But it was also a confession. The report was brief. Mulholland stated that the dam had been designed according to accepted engineering practices. He said the foundation had been inspected. He said the concrete had been tested. He said he had no explanation for the failure. He then offered his resignation. The water board refused to accept it. They said he was too valuable. They said the city needed him. But the public was already demanding answers. On March 19, 1928, Los Angeles County convened a coroner's inquest. The inquest was held in the Ventura County Courthouse. The room was packed. The jury consisted of 12 men. They were ordinary citizens, a farmer, a shopkeeper, a carpenter. They were tasked with determining the cause of death of the 431 victims, but the inquest quickly expanded into a broader investigation of the dam's design, construction, and operation. The first witness was the dam's designer himself, William Mulholland. He took the stand on the morning of March 21st. He was questioned by the district attorney, a man named John D. Fredericks. The exchange was tense. Fredericks asked Mulholland about the cracks. Mulholland admitted that cracks had appeared during construction. He said they were common in concrete dams. He said they were not a sign of instability. Fredericks asked about the leaks. Mulholland admitted that water had seeped through the foundation. He said it was expected. He said all dams leak. Fredericks asked about the red mud in the seepage. Mulholland paused. He said he had not seen the red mud himself. He had been told about it by his assistant. He had dismissed it as a normal phenomenon. Fredericks pressed harder. He produced a letter from a local rancher, written in December 1927, warning that the dam was leaking badly. Mulholland said he had not read the letter. He said his office had handled it. He said he trusted his staff. The inquest lasted 6 weeks. Over 60 witnesses were called. They included engineers, geologists, construction workers, local residents, and survivors. The testimony painted a picture of systemic failure. The foundation had not been properly tested. The geological surveys had been superficial. The concrete mix had been inconsistent. The dam had been built too quickly. The cracks had been ignored. The leaks had been ignored. The warnings had been ignored. One engineer, a man named Roy W. Carlson, testified that he had expressed concern about the foundation during construction. He said he had written a memo to Mulholland in April 1927, but had never received a reply. The memo was later found in Mulholland's files. It had been marked filed and never read. Another witness, a geologist named John C. Branner, testified that the site was geologically unstable. He said the left abutment sat on a layer of schist that was prone to slipping. He said he had warned the water department in 1925. His warning had been ignored. The most damning testimony came from a former water department employee, a man named Frank E. Weymouth. Weymouth had been the chief engineer for the Metropolitan Water District. He had worked with Mulholland on the Colorado River Aqueduct. He testified that Mulholland had a pattern of ignoring expert advice. He said Mulholland believed that his own experience was superior to any textbook. He said Mulholland had once told him, "I don't need a geologist to tell me where to put a dam." I can feel it in my bones." The inquest concluded on May 10, 1928. The jury returned a verdict of death by misadventure. They did not assign criminal liability. They said the failure was due to errors of judgment by the engineers and officials involved, but they also issued a series of recommendations. They called for independent review of all dam designs. They called for mandatory geological surveys. They called for regular inspections. They called for a state agency to oversee dam safety. The state legislature acted quickly. In 1929, California passed the Dam Safety Act. It created the Division of Safety of Dams within the Department of Water Resources. The division was given authority to approve designs, inspect construction, and order repairs. It was the first such agency in the United States. Other states followed. By 1935, most Western states had similar laws, but the legal aftermath did not end there. The survivors filed civil lawsuits against the city of Los Angeles. They sought damages for wrongful death and property loss. The cases were consolidated into a single class action. The trial began in 193 The city argued that the dam was an act of God. They said the foundation failure was unforeseeable. The plaintiffs argued that the city was negligent. They presented the same evidence from the inquest. The jury found in favor of the plaintiffs. The city was ordered to pay damages totaling over $5 million. That amount, adjusted for inflation, would be nearly $100 million today. The city appealed. The cases dragged on for years. Many families settled for small amounts. Others received nothing. Mulholland never fully recovered. He retired from the water department in 1928. He lived quietly in his home in Los Angeles. He rarely left the house. He suffered from depression. He was haunted by the faces of the dead. He died on July 22, 1935, at the age of 79. His obituary in the Los Angeles Times ran on the front page. It called him a genius and a tragic figure. It mentioned the dam collapse but did not dwell on it. The city had already moved on. But the city had not fully moved on. The disaster had exposed the fragility of the water system. Los Angeles depended on the aqueduct. Without the St. Francis Dam, the city had to find alternative storage. They built new reservoirs in the San Gabriel Mountains. They expanded the capacity of existing dams. They also began importing water from the Colorado River. The Colorado River Aqueduct was completed in 1994. It brought water from the river to the city through a series of tunnels and canals. The project was overseen by the Metropolitan Water District, the same agency that had warned Mulholland about the dam site. The St. Francis Dam collapse also changed the way engineers thought about dams. The disaster forced the profession to confront the limits of empirical knowledge. Before 1928, dam design was based largely on experience and rule of thumb. After 1928, it became a science. Engineers began using mathematical models to calculate stresses and strains. They began using soil mechanics to analyze foundations. They began using concrete testing to ensure quality. The field of geotechnical engineering, which studies the behavior of earth materials, emerged directly from the St. Francis disaster. But the lessons were not only technical, they were also human. The disaster showed that no system is safe if the people in charge refuse to listen. Mulholland was not a bad engineer. He was a brilliant one, but his brilliance became arrogance. He believed in his own judgment so completely that he could not see the evidence in front of him. The cracks were there. The leaks were there. The red mud was there. He chose to ignore them. What happened afterward was a slow but steady process of institutional reform. The profession built safeguards against individual hubris. Designs had to be reviewed. Foundations had to be tested. Inspections had to be documented. But the reforms could only go so far. They could not change human nature. They could not prevent the next disaster. In 1963, the Baldwin Hills Dam in Los Angeles failed, killing 5 people. The cause was a foundation problem again. In 1972, the Buffalo Creek Dam in West Virginia failed, killing 125 people. The cause was improper construction again. In 2003, the Zaya Dam in Russia failed, killing dozens. The cause was inadequate spillway capacity. In 2020, the Edenville Dam in Michigan failed, causing widespread flooding. The cause was insufficient design standards. The list goes on. Each disaster brings new regulations, new inspections, new reviews, but the fundamental problem remains. Dams are built by humans. Humans make mistakes. The earth is unpredictable. The water is relentless. The only way to prevent failure is to assume that failure is possible. That is the lesson the St. Francis Dam teaches. It is a lesson that is easy to forget but impossible to avoid. Today, the site of the dam is a quiet place. The trail is marked by signs. The concrete stubs sit in the canyon. The reservoir is gone. The water is gone, but the story is not gone. It lives in the engineering textbooks. It lives in the memories of the families. It lives in the warnings that are still being ignored. In 2015, the California Division of Safety of Dams released a report on the state's aging dams. It found that 43 dams were in need of immediate repair. The cost was estimated at $1 billion. The state legislature allocated only a fraction of that amount. The repairs were delayed. The cracks were ignored. The leaks were ignored. The warnings were ignored. On March 12, 2024, the 96th anniversary of the collapse, a small ceremony was held at the monument. About 50 people attended. They included descendants of survivors, local historians, and a few engineers. They laid a wreath. They read the names of the victims. They stood in silence. The wind blew through the canyon. The river ran clear. The sound of water was soft. Then the ceremony ended. The people left. The canyon returned to silence, but the question remained, what if we are wrong again? At 2 p.m. on the 13th of March 2024, a team of engineers from the California Division of Safety of Dams arrived at the site of the San Gabriel Dam, a concrete arch structure built in 1939 about 15 miles upstream from where the St. Francis Dam once stood. They had come to conduct a scheduled inspection. The dam was not unusual. It was one of hundreds across the state that had been operating for decades. The team checked the spillway gates, the drainage tunnels, the concrete itself. They measured seepage flows. They took core samples. Everything seemed normal. Only a few minutes later, something was off. One of the engineers noticed a small crack in the left abutment near the foundation. It was hairline, barely visible. He recorded it in his notes. He did not report it as urgent. He did not think much of it. He filed the paperwork and moved on. What happened next was not dramatic. The crack was not immediately dangerous. But it was a reminder that the system that was supposed to prevent another St. Francis had not eliminated the fundamental problem. The St. Francis Dam collapse had taught engineers to look for cracks, to analyze foundations, to test concrete. But it could not teach them to pay attention to every crack. The San Gabriel Dam crack was noted, but it was not flagged for immediate repair. The repair was scheduled for the following fiscal year. The budget was tight. The crack would wait. That same month, a team of geologists at the University of California, Berkeley, published a study on the long-term stability of the San Gabriel Mountains. They used satellite imagery to measure ground movement. They found that the entire mountain range was slowly sliding westward, a phenomenon called gravitational spreading. The movement was measured in millimeters per year, barely perceptible. But the study concluded that the cumulative effect over centuries could weaken the foundations of dams built on the slopes. The report was published in a peer-reviewed journal. It was read by a few specialists. It did not make headlines. It did not prompt any emergency measures. The warnings were there, but they were buried in academic language. The St. Francis Dam collapse was not just a failure of engineering. It was a failure of communication. The warnings had been available in one night. The leaks, the cracks, the red mud, the geologist's report, all of it was known. But the information did not reach the people who could act on it. The same pattern repeated itself in the decades that followed. In 1963, when the Baldwin Hills Dam failed, the state had known for years that the foundation was unstable. The dam had been built on a fault line that had caused minor earthquakes. The engineers had reinforced the structure, but the reinforcement was not enough. The warning had been there. It had been ignored. In 1972, the Buffalo Creek Dam in West Virginia failed after heavy rain. The dam was a coal waste impoundment, not a water storage dam. But the failure was caused by the same kind of structural weakness that had doomed St. Francis. The dam had been built too high, too steep, on a foundation that could not handle the load. The company had ignored warnings from state inspectors. The result was a wall of black water that killed 125 people in the valley below. The federal government investigated. They found that the company had falsified inspection reports. They found that the state had failed to enforce safety standards. The echoes of 1928 were unmistakable. In 2003, the Zaya Dam in Russia failed after a week of heavy rain. The spillway was too small to handle the flood. The water overtopped the dam and eroded the foundation. The dam collapsed. Dozens died. The Russian government had known the spillway was undersized. They had planned to upgrade it. The upgrade was delayed due to budget cuts. The warning was there. It was ignored. In 2020, the Edenville Dam in Michigan failed after heavy rain. The dam had been classified as high hazard for years. The state had ordered the owner to increase spillway capacity. The owner had not done it. The state did not enforce the order. The dam failed. Thousands were evacuated. No one died, but widespread flooding caused billions of dollars in damage. The warning was there. It was ignored. Each of these failures had a unique cause, but they all shared a common thread. Someone knew something was wrong. Someone filed a report. Someone made a recommendation. And then nothing happened. The system that was built after St. Francis, the inspections, the reviews, the regulatory oversight, was only as strong as the people who operated it. And people are fallible. They prioritize budgets over safety. They prioritize schedules over inspections. They prioritize convenience over caution. The St. Francis Dam collapse had created the Division of Safety of Dams, but the division could not force compliance. It could not make engineers pay attention to every crack. It could not make politicians allocate funds for repairs. It could not make the public care about infrastructure that was out of sight and out of mind. The disaster had been a wake-up call. But the wake-up call had faded over time. In 2015, the American Society of Civil Engineers released its infrastructure report card. It gave the nation's dams a grade of D. It estimated that over 15,000 dams in the United States were classified as high hazard, meaning a failure would cause loss of life. Of those, more than 2,000 were in poor or unsatisfactory condition. The report recommended increased funding for dam safety. The federal government allocated some money, but not enough. The states were left to manage their own programs. Some did it well, others did not. The same report noted that the average age of dams in the United States was over 50 years. Many had been built in the 193s and 194s, the era of large-scale federal projects. They were reaching the end of their design lives. They required major repairs or replacement. The cost was estimated at nearly $50 billion. The funding was not there. In California, the Division of Safety of Dams had about 60 engineers to oversee more than 1,200 dams. They tried to inspect each dam every few years, but they could not inspect all of them as often as they would like. They relied on the dam owners to report problems. The owners often did not report problems until they became emergencies. The same pattern had played out in 198. Mulholland had not reported the cracks. He had not reported the leaks. He had waited until it was too late. On the 12th of March 2028, the centennial anniversary of the St. Francis Dam collapse, a larger ceremony was planned at the monument. A new plaque was unveiled. It listed the names of all known victims, 432 in total, a number that had been revised upward over the years as more records were discovered. The governor of California gave a speech. He spoke of the lessons learned. He spoke of the importance of infrastructure investment. He promised to increase funding for dam safety. But the funding never came. The state budget was tight. The pandemic had drained resources. The economy was slow. The dam safety fund was cut. The repairs were delayed again. At the same ceremony, a group of engineering students from the University of Southern California presented a research project. They had used ground-penetrating radar to map the foundation of the St. Francis Dam site. They found remnants of the original abutment, buried under sediment. They found evidence of water channels that had eroded the foundation from below. They confirmed what the 1928 investigators had suspected. The failure had been caused by a slow, progressive weakening of the rock. The water had found a path. It had carved a tunnel. The dam had collapsed from within. The students also found something else. They found that the foundation of the nearby San Gabriel Dam, built decades later, had similar geological features. The same schist layer, the same potential for slipping, the same risk that had been ignored in One Night Wide. The students published their findings in an engineering journal. The paper was cited by a few specialists. It did not lead to any immediate action. The San Gabriel Dam continued to operate. The crack was still there. The repair was still delayed. What happened at St. Francis was not a one-time event. It was the same story that plays out in infrastructure failures around the world. A hazard is identified, a report is filed, a warning is issued, and then the warning is forgotten. The disaster happens. The investigation points to the same cause. The recommendations are made. The regulations are tightened. And then the cycle begins again. In 2028, the same year as the centennial, a study by the National Research Council examined the state of dam safety in the United States. It found that the regulatory framework had improved but still had gaps. The biggest gap was enforcement. Many states did not have the authority to force dam owners to make repairs. Some states did not have the funding to conduct inspections. The study concluded that the only way to prevent another St. Francis was to make dam safety a federal priority. But the political will was not there. The lesson of the St. Francis Dam collapse is not that dams are inherently dangerous. It is that the people who build and manage them must be humble. They must acknowledge that they do not know everything. They must listen to the geologists, the inspectors, the whistleblowers. They must act on warnings, even when those warnings are inconvenient. They must plan for failure, even when they believe they have designed a perfect structure. On the 12th of March 2028, after the ceremony ended, the students from USC stood at the edge of the canyon. They looked at the remaining concrete stubs, now worn smooth by decades of rain and wind. They talked about their research. They talked about the future. They wondered if the next St. Francis would happen in their lifetime. They hoped it would not, but they knew it might. The St. Francis Dam is gone. The water is gone. The dead are gone, but the problem remains. The canyon is quiet. The river runs clear. The sound of water is soft. And the question stands, what if we are wrong again?